If there is any lens that was really designed to impress in the Sony E-mount system, it would have to be the 50mm f1.2 G Master. But this lens is large, heavy, and well, do you really need f1.2? In this video, I'm going to give you my review of the 50mm f1.2 G Master and answer the question as to whether I think this lens is worth it, and maybe if you really should consider it as well. So to talk about the specs and features of this lens goes from an aperture of f1.2 all the way down to f16. The lens has a minimum focusing distance of 1.3 feet, or roughly 40 centimeters. It has a total of 11 different aperture blades on the lens and in its design. The lens weighs roughly 1.7 pounds, or 778 grams. So certainly a good weight and size overall if you're someone that likes a bit chunkier of a lens and something that would help stable out your shots, say if you're shooting handheld. The lens also has a 72mm front filter thread for being able to adapt different step-up rings and other types of filters to the lens. Of course, this is a full-frame lens, so you're going to get a 50mm field of view and or a 75mm field of view if used in aps-c crop mode or on a Sony aps-c camera. And yes, this is an autofocusing lens, as this switch and other elements will indicate, though it does not include any optical image stabilization built into the lens. Now, because this is one of the newer, though not the newest, Sony G Master lenses, it's going to include a lot of different traits that you'll find on other Sony G Master lenses. This includes the lens being both dust and moisture resistant, the lens utilizing Sony's latest linear autofocusing motors, so you're going to get incredibly fast and responsive autofocus on this, perhaps more so than many of other Sony's lenses. And of course, physically, the lens also bears many similarities to other G Master lenses. This includes an aperture ring that is clickable, as you can hear, and with the flip of a switch, can also be declickable as well. You also have, as noted previously, an autofocus to manual focus switch that you can directly control on the lens itself. You have a manual focus ring that will do essentially focus by wire on Sony's cameras. And you also have your selection of two different programmable buttons that you can set on the lens, one along the left side, as you can see right here, and one along the top of the lens. One omission perhaps from this lens might be the fact that other newer Sony lenses do have an iris lock switch. This one does not, so you might find the aperture ring is potentially more susceptible to being adjusted accidentally compared to some of the latest Sony G Master lenses. Now, much like the many similar lens characteristics, this also comes with the usual assortment of G Master lens accessories, which if you watch my unboxing video for the 50mm f1.2 G Master, you might have already seen. Of course, this means it includes a lens hood, a series of manuals, and a nice soft padded bag, among other things. So let's talk a little bit about what I've used this lens for, and truthfully, there is a lot to talk about. On the photography side, I really do think this lens is stunning. Yes, of course for portraits, because again, 50mm is close to what the human eye sees, but really, this is where some of that f1.2 magic can truly be utilized. I have done several portraits with this lens and have been pleased, really, whether using it in regular full-frame mode or in aps-c crop mode. F1.2 on a lens like this really lets you isolate your subject very much in a similar way to the type of compression you might find in a longer telephoto lens. And yes, of course, a shallow depth of field like that will lend itself to sharpness, at least with your subject, but really, this lens and many of Sony's G Master primes are exceptionally sharp, and the 50mm f1.2 G Master is perhaps a perfect example of this. So just to do a quick evaluation on the sharpness of this lens as we dig into Lightroom, here as you can see we're doing a classic brick wall test at f1.2 using my Sony a7R5. Yes, when examining the center of the lens, we have an extremely sharp image. As we start to navigate in and around to the top, and to the sides, this remains the case as well. But perhaps even most importantly, when we evaluate the corners of this lens, we are getting exceptionally sharp image quality, even at its most shallow depth of field. Now yes, you will notice there is a bit of barrel distortion, and that is to be expected. Of course, that is nothing that profile corrections can't fix, and that becomes, I would say, less pronounced as you start to go and stop down the lens. But yes, that's just a brief tangent around shooting from the photo side. Let's talk about what I've used this lens for video. I've used the 50mm f1.2 G Master on a series of weddings. This has ended up becoming one of my favorite lenses to use for details, mostly for a couple of reasons. Again, number one, its close focusing distance at 50mm, but also at the 75mm aps-c crop size, means that you can get almost pseudo macro-like shots with this lens. Yes, I've actually used it for details for things like wedding rings, flat lays, and other sorts of detail situations, and the shots out of this for situations like that have always looked stellar. I've actually really liked using this lens for ceremonies to get a slightly wider perspective, whether from a side angle, a rear angle as a safety shot, or again to get closer to that portrait side when in crop mode. And I think because of that, this lens offers itself as almost perhaps an 85mm portrait lens replacement that can also offer you that mid-range focal length, and that makes it a very compelling option again, for weddings, but also other situations. Now, of course, being an f1.2 lens, this also lends itself incredibly well to different low light situations, and that is where we start to get into some of the benefits that f1.2 really offers. So yes, on the wedding front, this is one of my lenses that is sort of my plan B whenever I need to save a really dark or not so great lighting situation. Yes, sometimes the dance floor is not as illuminated as you might hope or expect, or a DJ does not want you to have the floor lit up the entire night, and so therefore it is a lens like this that is going to save you in a case like that. Because yes, something like the 50mm f1.2 G Master paired with a camera like the Sony a7S III, and perhaps going to 24 frames a second versus 60, is going to allow you to let in so much more light that will keep your ISO and overall your noise performance in a very safe range compared to what you might be pushing if you were dealing with a classic f2.8 zoom or another type of situation with a lens much less forgiving. Now, stepping out of the wedding front, I also recently got to shoot this lens on a recent concert videography experience, and in that case, this lens actually was the main determining factor for getting great low light shots, because yes, I shot that concert on the Sony a7R V, and though Sonys are great low light cameras in general, that is not known as a low light king to the extent that the a7S III or FX3 is, and so it was the 50mm f1.2 G Master at f1.2 that was the difference maker in getting those great low light shots. And of course, this wasn't just a great test of what f1.2 can do, this was also an extremely solid test of the lens's autofocusing capabilities, with a lot of active movement and subjects moving around in different directions. Not surprisingly, the lens's linear autofocus motors perform exceptionally well in this situation. Yes, being a more modern Sony G Master Prime lens, you're going to get a fair amount of focus breathing. This lens is certainly no exception to that, but of course, modern Sony cameras also now have breathing compensation, and therefore pretty much any focus breathing with this, like all those other Sony lenses, becomes a non-factor at that point. Also, of course, worth noting, as you're seeing in many of these different shots, the bokeh renders very beautifully, very spherical, yes, at 1.2, and even when stopped down in different apertures as well. Now, of course, I've used this lens in many other situations as well. That includes interviews, where again, in regular full frame mode, can provide a nice medium to pseudo-wide shot, or again, in aps-c crop mode, can start to lend itself to the tight angle, as you're seeing now. I've also managed to shoot sports with this lens, where again, the fast autofocusing speed really lends itself to being a great pairing there. Ultimately, a 50 is a 50, and that means it's going to find itself widely applicable in a number of different use cases, and that's part of what makes this focal length so great. So of course, to talk about the 50mm f1.2 G Master, we also have to talk about its price. This lens retails for around $2,000 US, or you might find it for around $1,900 US, discounted at various times, and truthfully, this is going to be pricey compared to other options in the Sony system. Of particular note now being the 50mm f1.4 G Master that was recently released, that retails for around $1,300 US, and or the 55mm f1.8 Zeiss Sonner lens that retails for around $900 to $1,000 US, that I've done a separate review on this channel already that I will leave a link to above and in the description below that you can check out. And of course, that's ignoring many other different 50mm options at different price points in the Sony E-mount system. I love the 55mm in the time that I had it, and f1.8 met most of my needs there, and I truly think for probably a lot of people the 50mm f1.4 might be more than enough for what they're looking for. So with all of that said, why would you need something like the 50mm f1.2 G Master? As I mentioned in that other review of the 55mm, the 50 f1.2 G Master is a showpiece lens at a showpiece price point. Not everyone is going to need f1.2 aperture, but there might be a case or two where that extra third or two-thirds of a stop of light make a major difference with what you're shooting. Or perhaps you're someone that actually prefers a slightly larger lens setup where you have a little bit of added weight to help with smoothing out your shots and getting a little bit more of a steady handheld look compared to a lighter nifty 50. The 50mm f1.2 G Master remains a shining example of the best that Sony can do with its prime lenses. It truly was an impressive feat of engineering when Sony released this lens and proved to the world that they could do f1.2 with the Sony E-mount. And even though I may not have needed f1.2 or this particular 50mm lens when I got it, I am truly glad that I did, have benefited from having it ever since. I can certainly say that picking up Sony's arguably best prime G Master lens was a good decision. So that is my take on the 50mm f1.2 G Master lens. Hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. There are a number of lens videos on this channel that I would definitely encourage you to check out, and many more on the way, so definitely stay tuned for those. For now, that is all I have to say, so thanks for watching.